Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third annual Sustainability Week US. Today, we are joined by an esteemed panel for a discussion on forestry at the frontier. How can companies and indigenous communities secure the future of forests? My name is Pratima Singh, and I'm a principal with the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. I want to start today by introducing our panel. We have a group of esteemed guests, including Santiago Gowland, Chief Executive, Rainforest Alliance, Ana Hinojosa, Senior Advisor, Oratain, Nicole Rycroft, Founder and Executive Director at Canopy, and Ashley Gill, Chief Strategy Officer at the Textile Exchange. And we are here today to discuss the future of our forests. To set the context and give you a little bit of a benchmark, 10,000 years ago, 57% of the world's habitable land was covered by forests. This equaled to about 6 billion hectares. But today, we've lost one third of our forests. We only have about 4 billion hectares left. And we all know that an end to deforestation is possible, yet we need to make progress to actually ensure this outcome. With that in mind, some of the things we want to discuss today are what steps are companies taking to become good custodians of the land? How can firms ensure that their supply chains are not contaminated with timber from illegal deforestation? Can investment in forests be good for nature as well as for companies' bottom lines? We are looking to get practical information, tangible insights, and concrete actions to be able to share examples of projects and initiatives that have measurable, verifiable, replicable, and scalable impact. We also want to make sure that we hear from different stakeholder groups involved in these initiatives that have varying perspectives so that we can come together and ensure sustainable progress. So, with that in mind, and to get us started, let's take a little step back and lay out the context for this challenge that's facing us. And I'd love to hear from our participants today. What is the extent of the problem here? And what's the urgency to act now? Santiago, could I turn it over to you?
This is a bit of the call of our generation, right? Because this decade we are at a crossroads. Some of the most important forests in the planet, like tropical forests, are reaching a tipping point. The science in the Amazon is very clear about the levels of deforestation in the Amazon can result in a savanization of the region. We already see, shorter hydrological cycles, rain, in areas that are heavily deforested. And the Amazon, for example, just some, from Latin America, so I'll pick on that one first, is 10% of the global carbon in the planet, right? So when you look at this and the level of biodiversity and the extent of indigenous communities and people that depend on those forests, right? This triple crisis between climate, water, biodiversity, people, it can't be more urgent. And this, need to revert the level of deforestation. When you look at the numbers for 2022 and 2021, there's been more deforestation of prime forest, like 4 million hectares, more than 4 million hectares, which is the size of the UK. So we're at this point where protecting and just doing less harm and compliance is not enough. We need to start to accelerate the healing, the restoration, the reparation, the regeneration of those forests at the same time. And so this is the conundrum, right? It's like the agenda is shifting from a protection compliance agenda only to become a market-driven regeneration agenda, very, very quickly and at scale. And so the interesting thing for me in terms of tackling that problem is that markets that used to be or are the culprits, if you look at agriculture, 80% of the deforestation comes from expanding the agricultural frontier and 25% of greenhouse gases. And when you look at agricultural forestry, 4 out of 5 people living in rural areas live in poverty. But then look at agriculture from a different lens and think about it. It's 40% of the global employment and 12% of the global GDP, right? It's a massive force. And for people living in the South, in more developing countries, agriculture is the make it or break it or of economic well-being, of social development. So how do we use then the force of agriculture and forestry for good? How do we use that market-based model to accelerate and scale up the restoration and regeneration of the landscapes that matter the most, right? This tropical forest, through the sectors that have the biggest impact at a speed and scale that matters this decade. How do we do that? How do we make sure that value flows towards the regeneration versus the extractive, degeneration model that today primes in commodity markets and global supply chains? How can that be done? I'll leave it there so we can then talk about solutions.
That's great. Thank you, Santiago. Yes, please, Nicole, go ahead.
Fatima, maybe I can just jump in and build on perhaps some of the themes that Santiago was pointing out there. I think this is normally the part of the conversation where we all reach for a bottle of wine, right? The ecological challenges, the fact that we all know that forests are foundational for life on Earth. They are kind of home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. They store an estimated 260 gigatons of carbon. We've seen over the past decade 25 million hectares of forest lost by various kind of supply chains and degradation. And so that's led to both a massive release of carbon, an estimated 10 gigatons of carbon, as well as the fact that there's this incredible loss of biodiversity. Like, we are grappling with two parallel ecological crises: the precipitous decline in biodiversity and the climate crisis. And so we often think of this as an ecological crisis or challenge. And the scientific community are very clear that, we need to be protecting 30 to 50% of the world's forests by 2030 and restoring them back to health, the degraded areas back to health. And keeping forests standing has been identified as one of the cheapest, fastest, most effective ways for us to stabilize our climate. But of course, to build on one of Santiago's points, that we can't keep them standing if we continue to mow them down to make pizza boxes and t-shirts, or to kind of clear new agricultural lands. And so what we also have, and what really is at the heart of it, is a human behavioral challenge and problem, that we're actually, rather than an ecological problem, like, it's our unsustainable consumption that is driving the destruction and loss of forest ecosystems. And I would say that the debate needs to be about more than just illegal logging and deforestation. It needs to be around forest degradation more broadly, because there's a lot of logging that happens that is legal but completely unsustainable. And there's a lot of logging that happens that isn't technically deforestation, but is devastating to climate critical forest ecosystems. And so it really is around, we currently use 5 billion trees every year to make paper, packaging, viscose textiles, pulp products more broadly. And these make, waste production systems that are relics of the 20th century and need to be left back there. That's kind of really, I think, the challenge that we need to manage and grapple with, to ensure that any of our commodities, packaging or textiles, don't come from high carbon, high biodiversity value landscapes, and that we really accelerate the transition to more circular production, production systems that rely on what are currently seen as waste feedstocks that have a significantly lower footprint going in as a raw material, discarded clothing, agricultural residues, industrial food waste, and then also carry a significantly lighter manufacturing footprint. And so I think those are some of the fun areas where we're starting to see some very exciting traction in the marketplace.
Yes, thanks for that. I think, go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that Textile Exchange is working in the fashion and textile industry specifically, and so much of what Santiago and Nicole have said really rings true with the baselining that we've done on GHG emissions in 2019. We're aiming for a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the fiber and material part of the supply chain, while also looking at soil health, biodiversity, and water. And forests are such an important component of that target. Understanding what it looks like to both protect them, but also to transition away from using new materials. And so we've identified specifically finding solutions that have lower, are emitting less carbon, but also moving away from new materials altogether and looking at new recycled sources of materials and that type of thing. And there is a lot of reliance on forestry or adjacent agriculture that puts pressure on these ancient and endangered forests. Things like man-made cellulosics and viscose is the obvious one, but we also get leather from the cattle industry, which we know is putting the Amazonia region at risk. There's also land use change that's driven by cotton production, several other things. And so even if you don't think that your particular business has ties to forestry or has ties to anything that might be adjacent, that may actually not be true. And I think that points to a different problem around this concept of transparency in the supply chain. And there's so often the case that companies don't understand even, maybe they're direct or indirect suppliers, but even where those suppliers are getting their materials. And there is going to be increased pressure from policymakers, from legislation, for companies not only to know where their materials are coming from, but also to be accountable for the practices and potential detriments that are happening in those regions. And so I think understanding your supply chain and finding more transparency, building in more traceability into the supply chain is also a really important component of this.
Yeah, no, these are all really interesting points. And I know in case someone has anything they want to respond to. Yes, go ahead, Anna.
Actually, I wanted to jump in. I think Ashley did a great job. Well, Santiago and Nicole as well. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about how globalization has certainly driven quite a bit of importing and exporting of products all over the world, and demands for goods from other places where maybe we're not able to see the effects of the demands of the products that we're consuming, because those products are being produced somewhere else and the effects of that production are in another place. I've spent my adult life in the government and as a regulator, and so most recently I've been now on the private sector side and looking at realistically how companies are reacting to regulations and the effect and effectiveness of regulations. And I think one of the things that Ashley mentioned about businesses needing to have some clear transparency into their supply chain is absolutely important. There's so many different regulations around the world that are mandating that, because we have seen some negative impacts to the environment and to many other aspects that the international trade community can no longer just say it's not us, we're not responsible. The consumers are demanding that companies who are selling them the products that they're consuming are being responsible. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about in this panel and really bring out is how governments can make sure that the regulations that they're passing are actually bringing about the change or bringing about the solutions that they think the regulations are putting forward. And I think to the extent that governments are passing laws or regulations that say you need to have transparency and you need to exercise due diligence, that there needs to be a little better understanding of what the expectations are, and that what used to be in the past in the way of like writing some sort of a report or submitting some sort of information, and the government would just basically, stamp it in and put it away until next year, that is no longer effective, and that's no longer acceptable. And so I'm really excited to have an opportunity to get deeper into these discussions, and making sure that when we say that businesses need to be responsible, that responsibility goes beyond checking a box or submitting a piece of paper, that there does need to be some trusting of your suppliers, understanding who your suppliers are, but also putting some verification into what your suppliers are providing.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually, and thank you, everyone, for that context. I think we've kind of already started moving towards, and I do want to dig into these solutions. I think that we've talked a little bit about, the ecological, behavioral side of things, some of the big culprits that we spoke of, food, agriculture, packaging, materials industries, all of that. But I think we've kind of moved to something which is really interesting around supply chain. So it's any business rather than specific sectors, right? Everyone has a role to play here. What do we need to do? How can businesses, and I'm just sort of like feeding off of where you left it, which is how do we ensure that transparency in the supply chain? Sometimes it's just not possible that businesses at the end know exactly where all of that is coming from. How do we ensure that information actually translates through the supply chain so that businesses on one side can make decisions about where they're getting sourcing inputs from and other things? What are some of the solutions here, tangible solutions that companies can employ, businesses can employ to enable that transparency?
Well, I think there are a number of different solution providers out there that are trying to provide technology that can support businesses. Ultimately, I think what is important is that every business who is bringing products to a market, whether it's a domestic market or an international market, that they understand that there's a responsibility connected to that, and that responsibility goes beyond just producing the product and selling the product, but rather there are laws, rules, and regulations, and there's also effects on whether it's social effects or environmental effects in that production of those goods. And today's consumers are very focused on that, and so important for brand protection, important for the success of the company, is making sure that the companies are social responsibilities into consideration, social and environmental responsibilities into consideration. So if I talk a little bit about some of the, bringing it back towards forestry and kind of deforestation issues, obviously it's important for companies that are involved in products that need to be produced in lands that could either involve trees or involve land that causes trees to be impacted. Those companies need to know exactly how their products are being produced, and where those products are coming from. When you talk about the regulations that are being passed, I think they are a very good step forward, but how that implementation comes into effect will be very important. Getting to the trust but verify concept of it. If we're asking companies to exercise due diligence and report on their due diligence, that due diligence needs to be more codified, I think, more intentionally explained, so that companies know that it isn't just filing a report, that you do actually have to go visit the places where your products are being made. There are ways of actually being able to verify that the claimed origin of the products that you are selling is actually what you're selling. In some cases, there are substitutions of products, or people are claiming that the products are compliant with deforestation rules or other regulations, but that isn't in fact the case.
Yeah, the whole other. Sorry, Nicole, I'll turn it over to you just a minute. I think there's a whole other conversation here about just making sure that we have the information and are communicating that. But there's another entire sector here that can talk about greenwashing and not actually, not just saying what you're doing, but actually not saying what you're doing and saying something completely different entirely. But we will not talk about that today because we want to talk about what good looks like. So, Nicole, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've hit on a very kind of hot topic at the moment. So that's a whole other session in itself. But, you know, supply chains, they don't sound very sexy. But when it comes to stabilizing our climate, supply chains are the hottest ticket on the planet, right? Like for most brands, up to 90% of their carbon footprint is wrapped up in their scope 3 emissions, or the raw materials that they're making their kind of goods and wares from. And so dealing with the supply chain, and especially the raw material sourcing part of it, is really critical, both from a global climate effort as well as for brands, mitigating risk as well as, you know, building supply chains that are climate resilient for the 21st century. And so transparency is definitely an important element, and I would say kind of like starting point, because when there's a shadow and there's a lack of line of sight, that's where bad practices can hide. But it is really important to then translate that through into action plans and into, I think, sort of, you know, no single company can transform an entire supply chain by themselves. And so that's where vehicles of collective action become really important. And oftentimes we're told that supply chains will take decades and decades to transform. And I think one of the things that we've seen in Canopy's work within the fashion supply chain and our focus on transforming the viscose supply chain over the past 9 years is that change can actually happen in years rather than decades. You know, we started our work to transform the viscose supply chain and its impact on forest ecosystems at a time when really most people had absolutely no idea, even within brands, that there were 300 million trees disappearing into viscose textiles. If we fast forward to today, we have more than 530 brands on board, formally committed to the Canopy Style Initiative, committed to not sourcing from H&N endangered forests, committed to helping spur the production of circular next-gen alternatives and to conserving forest ecosystems. Those brands, including H&M and LVMH and Zara and Stella McCartney and many, many others, represent about $900 billion in purchasing annual revenue. So a lot of purchasing muscle. And because of them consistently stepping in, sending a very clear message back through the supply chain, we now have viscose producers that represent 90% of global production on board with similar commitments. And more than half of this global supply chain now verified with green shirts or at low risk of sourcing from H&N endangered forests. And I think the most exciting part of it about this supply chain transforming in real time is the fact that we now have the transition to next-gen production happening. We have 7 of those big conventional viscose producers on market now with products that are partly made from discarded clothing. We have the world's first next-gen pulp mill for viscose production that relies on hundreds of millions of old jeans and t-shirts that would otherwise degrade into methane in landfill, rather than requiring huge swaths of forest. That mill has been built in the old kind of shuttered bones of or in the bones of an old shuttered wood-based pulp mill in northern Sweden. It is a classic kind of swords to plowshares example. It uses 90% less water and 5 tons less carbon per ton of product. And Renewcell was able to come online partly because brands have sent this very clear signal back through the supply chain. It's a new technology being invested in at scale. That market pull-through, explicit market pull-through in Canopy's work with brands and with viscose producers to develop offtake agreements for the first 5 years for more than half of the production of that mill is what boosted investor confidence to step in and actually unlock the finance package. And so the kind of transition to circular production is happening, and now it's really around how do we actually accelerate that so that it happens on timelines that are ecologically meaningful?
And urgent, exactly. Ashley, Nicole's, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to build on that, right? So I completely agree with Nicole, right? So market-based models, supply chains have the power right now probably to tackle this at the speed and the scale that is needed, right? I mean, very few mechanisms have that level of speed and scale to tackle this, right? But there's two things I want to add to that traceability and that supply chain responsibility that will be needed. The Rainforest Alliance works with 5,000 companies, right, in 70 countries, and we, really work with these tropical forest commodities with more than 6 million producers. And so it's been kind of a journey, right, on the last 35 years, how to create this compliance, certification, auditing mechanisms to reduce negative impacts, right? But that's not enough. And what half percent, the 50% of what we do is now designing landscape and community projects that go deeper. And why I say this, right? Because companies right now, if we want to see value flowing towards restoration, need to not only create, work at the supply chain level, but also include, the brand and how we're going to bring citizens along, right? So there needs to be data flowing from the impact on the ground to claims and stories, and how we're going to bring citizens along. You need also a pathway to help companies really document how they are achieving their goals, net zero, origin, whatever. So that data is also needed. You need also data to bring shareholders along, right? So the whole ESG new space, right? You need data to bring investors and show that the market-based model has a high return investment and is highly leveraged. So we need to begin to see that this agenda is not just, a compliance to reduce the risk of operational disruptions or reputation disruptions at the supply chain level, but it's really at the center of a new business model that looks at, your supply chain partners, your consumers, your stakeholders, your shareholders, and drive that agenda forward. And the second thing for me that is a critical shift in how we've been working in the past and we need to work in the future is that the cost of competition now is higher than the cost of collaboration for the things, right? So this concept of companies in the past began to say, okay, there is an angle here. I can become the more sustainable brand and claim all of this, and I'm going to be the company associated with whatever. And the level of fragmentation, the level of competition, the level of atomization on the ground is really killing the speed and the scale of this movement. So the ability to bring the full value chain on a shared responsibility agenda, but then build those alliances with governments and with other industries, be it the finance industry, whatever, is another key thing. So how to capture that impact, translate it into data to really feed not just procurement, but also brand, sustainability, finance, right? And how to strengthen those alliances to deploy shared strategies, collective action that can accelerate the impact, I think is going to be critical.
Very interesting. I think that one of the themes that sort of emerged from sort of this discussion is also it's not just about do no harm, it's about do good. How are you able to actually positively impact in a good way? So that I think also comes back to some of the things that we talked about. Go ahead, Santiago.
Well, there are cases like I just came from the Petén, right, in Guatemala 2 weeks ago. This is one of the most, sort of in the Mayan biosphere, important forests, right? And there are concessions for 500,000 hectares. You can see there, the Rainforest Alliance has been working for more than 20 years there. You can see that sustainable forest management, right, is resulting in those concessions in zero deforestation rates. Actually, the last 2 years, it's net positive. The result, $100 million in the last 10 years of timber and non-timber products that are lifting the community, 17,000 jobs, right? And it's just incredible that when you look at it, right, when you build this alliance between the market and the community, and you really put the producer and the community at the center, listening and building that trust for the long run, and you work in service of those communities to broker better deals, better market access, better premiums, better insurance, whatever, these models work. So it's just kind of an understanding that if we want to get it right, we need to be all in. We need to really build alliances that are much stronger, but they are bottom up, based on supporting the producer and not parachuted from the north, saying, hey, this is what you need to do. It's really listening and hanging on there for decades to get this model right. Thank you, Priscilla.
I was just trying to add to what both Santiago and Nicole mentioned about a lot of progress being made in certain industries and certain companies really going the extra mile to try to do the right things, trying to protect the forests, and a big part of that. I think that when we talk about supply chains and where there are some risks in the supply chains, those companies that are doing great work, there are solutions out there that can help them be able to demonstrate that and protect themselves from imposters to some extent, because we want those companies who are doing good to be rewarded by consumers being able to purchase those products and support the great work that they're doing, and being able to verify the authenticity of those products is important. And technology today is really helping with that, whether it's forensic technology on its own or forensic technology with data science, are really helping companies be able to better police their own supply chains and be able to verify that the products that they're putting before their consumers are those products that are helping the environment.
And maybe Santiago kind of touched on community and community engagement. And I think one of the stakeholders and I think it's a poor term, but indigenous peoples and indigenous nations are often missing from decision-making tables. And they currently steward or have governance over lands that hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. They need to have a seat at decision-making tables. They need to be supported and resourced to be able to meaningfully engage at those tables and to develop robust conservation-based economies that aren't necessarily extractive or based on timber or wood fiber coming out of their traditional territories, but are diversified and maybe kind of help are based partly on the ecological services that their landscapes provide. And what we're seeing is a growing number of our brand partners are increasingly investing in programs that support those on-the-ground efforts led by Indigenous nations or groups that are working with Indigenous communities, be it through philanthropy, be it through high-quality offset programs. I think this is a really important part. And Megan, I'm sure in terms of textile exchanges work, be it with cotton farmers or wool farmers, you've probably had similar kinds of experiences.
Ashley, did you want to jump in?
I would like to. Thank you. Nicole, you said that supply chains are not sexy, but there's so much about what everybody just said that I just keep wanting to jump in on, because I think the capability that transparency and those technology tools can give us is great. But if we ever think that that's the end, that just technology is going to solve these problems for us, right, they really need to be a tool that we use to connect to the supply chain. And I love what Nicole just said around really centering this on the Indigenous communities that have for generations before us protected and given their governance over these areas. And Santiago, what you said about having producer-centered practices. And I think that's why transparency is important. And I think sometimes we can get a bit caught up, and brands really want to, to use the best tools and use all of the information. But I think it's really important why those tools are in place. And it's really about creating that connection across the supply chain. And it's something that Textile Exchange has done for a number of years. We did focus, Nicole mentioned, we focused on cotton for a number of years before we've sort of broadened to look beyond in all fibers and material areas. And one of the things that we're doing, similar to, I think, this conversation, is a recent call to action looking specifically at the leather supply chain and how brands could potentially direct funding to producers that are in these locations that can use that funding to grow and expand production that is done in balance with nature and that is done to protect deforestation. And right now, there's a lot of lack of transparency, especially between the food industry and into the leather supply chain. And so we feel like using mechanisms like this that almost bypass in some ways the supply chain and allow these companies to invest in producers directly could be a way for us to build that up over time, to help build the traceability over time so that we can move to entirely deforestation-free supply chains. But again, if we look at the macro view, the aim of this is something that really challenges the growth trajectory that the industry is on. And is it really sustainable to say that we're going to continue to grow these sources of materials when we understand the risk that they're putting on the environment? And so I think having great transparency, having programs that really put the producers first has to be at the center of this. It has to be part of what we're doing. But we also need to look at how we're transitioning to a circular economy, how we're moving away from just taking new things and this expand model and into something that is actually, moving us away from using new materials. There are so many materials that are, sitting in landfill that we also have the technology to process and to use as new materials. And so that's the kind of shift that we're also hoping to see.
That's interesting. I think, go ahead, Santiago, just quickly before I turn to you, one final thing I think that, and I also am cognizant of time, so just a quick word from you. But before that, I think it's interesting because I think we need to be able to account for, and we know we do nature-based accounting and other things, but we need to be able to account for or discount for waste or collecting from rainforests or other forests, and actually account for things and amplify things like community engagement and decision making and other things. How do we make sure that our accounting mechanisms to that point of data are actually reflective of our objectives as a society that's trying to manage climate change, but also further social and other progress? So sorry, Santiago, I know you probably have a little addition.
Thanks. I just want to underscore again what Ashley was saying about the indigenous communities and producers at the center, because I think that's the big failure of the sustainability market, right? I mean, there's billions of dollars spent on anything and everything, but when you go to the field, where the mosquitoes bite, you don't see anybody really, and you see this, indigenous communities, right, selling either the coffee or timber or whatever, or putting cows and soy at a commodity price. And that's a tragedy because they're sitting at the center of one of the most valuable assets on the planet on which our lives depend. Those prime forests in terms of the carbon and biodiversity value, but also the culture and the ways of living of that wisdom of people that can live with nature in harmony. And so, going straight to looking, listening, and seeing what's the benefit to keep the forest standing versus cutting it. How can that benefit be irresistible? How can we 10x the level of benefit so that you can see real kind of improvement? That's for me the challenge, at least at the Rainforest Alliance for 2030, moving into a pool model to have those producer support platforms and alliances that over-deliver on benefit so that the transition towards protecting, restoring, and regeneration can be accelerated. And it will be accelerated and scaled up only when the pull is irresistible. Only
Yeah.
when the neighbor, user, etc., see that joining that movement is the best for their future generations, for themselves, for the kids, for the communities. That's the respect that is required in order to shift that system.
I totally agree. I think for us, we think about, like at Canopy, we're thinking about how do we make next gen part of the aspirational lifestyle so that it then becomes the norm. And I think, Pratama, your point around scaling these nature positive solutions is a really, like, that's the thing we have to wrestle to the ground. I mean, we're seeing increasingly our brand partners are decoupling their financial performance from raw material use. A number of our brand partners now have targets to reduce by 50% the use of raw materials by 2030. We see that as a really positive thing. They're looking at kind of what are the new business models, obviously replacing virgin wood fiber in viscose and packaging, as well as the other kind of fibers that they use, will be key, replacing that with circular next gen production. But I think, there are key elements, the strong and focused market pull-through signaled with policy, creating pre-competitive spaces for that, mobilizing infrastructure levels of investment, because there is going to have to be kind of an overhaul for the packaging and paper and viscose supply chains over the course of the next 10 years. We estimate that there's a $78 billion investment that's required to achieve and to bring online 60 million tons of new next-gen production capacity. So there's work to be done there. Clearly, there needs to be the kind of the pipeline of the game-changing tech and incentives, market incentives and government incentives for conventional producers that are currently have a big footprint on forests to transition over their practices. Of course, sustainable supply chains have to have justice and human well-being at their core. Government regulations can play a great role in turning off the tap for the bad, as well as incentivizing innovations with zero interest loans or the various mechanisms that are available. And then I think there's the more ethereal element, which is around courage. Right? Like, we are charting a new path forward. And so all of us on this call, as well as all of the brand partners and investors that are out there, we all need to be stepping a little bit outside of our comfort zone or the normal way of doing business to reimagine the path forward.
That's a great summary. Thank you. Anna, Ashley, I'll also just maybe if you have one final closing thought for the next 30 seconds, because I know we're at time. If not, I will just do a quick summary before we close.
Well, I'd love
Great.
to just add that I think that the great work that all of the environmental organizations and organizations that are so focused on what is happening, it translates into laws and regulations that governments put in place. And as Nicole mentioned, those laws can either be an incentive or a disincentive for companies. And I think it's important to ensure that there are tools for making those laws as effective as possible.
I think the only thing I would add is just to say that I think part of what has put us in this situation is the fact that there are people who are benefiting from it. And those people may be in the minority. But I think the point around that Santiago made earlier around having the option to become a sustainable producer, for that to have so much value and so much benefit that people can't resist it. And I think we all have a responsibility to really investigate and think about who is benefiting from the systems that are in place, and what would it look like to change that dynamic, to have more accountability for those that are benefiting, and to have more benefit from those that really are at the center of this, and that are at the center of making this transition happen at the forestry level, but also around the edges of that we're ensuring that we're protecting them, not just for this generation and for the immediate future, but also for generations to come.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I want to just sort of use this one little spiel here to say it's been a great conversation, lots of learning. I think we've touched on some really interesting points around how do you hold people accountable? How do you do good versus do harm? What are the factors around restoration that we need to be valuing? And the role of regulation, the role of technology, the role of stakeholder engagement, community engagement, all really critical, actionable insights that we can take to our audience. So with that, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for sharing your insights, for sharing these examples, and also thank you to everyone for joining us today. Please do stay tuned for the next session that's going to be on water security, and have a great day.